This engine won the SCCA Production B category every single year it was entered. It beat Ferrari and Jaguar in Europe. It won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. It went to Bonneville and set 23 individual land speed records. It won the hill climbs on the European continent and here in America. It won Targa Florio and the RAC Trophy Championship in the GT category. Then it went drag racing and set class records, all in its 3-year short time frame of production. I'm talking about the Ford 289. So the story all began in 1962 when the Windsor family was born, and the whole design concept between the Windsor family was to build a lightweight V8 that was built around economy. One of the major changes that they made in the design of the motor is it didn't have a deep skirt like the previous Y blocks and the FE big blocks. This saved a lot of weight, not to mention the cylinder bores had thin wall casting technology. The first fire-breathing V8 that was developed from the Windsor family was a 221. It developed a whopping 145 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. It's always been designed as a big bore, short stroke motor. The first 221 had a 3.5-inch bore and a 2.87-inch stroke. It wasn't long though until 1963 that the 221 was already being phased out into yet another displacement class, the 260. The 260 was originally called the Challenger V8. It had a slightly bigger bore, which was 3.8 inches, but kept the same 2.87-inch stroke. Its horsepower was 164 at 4,400 RPM. However, there was something about this lightweight V8 that caught the eye of someone really important, a guy named Carroll Shelby.
My name's Carroll Shelby, and performance is my business.
Maybe you heard of him? Carroll Shelby talked to Ford and got several of the 260 V8s to put into his 1962 and 63 Cobras. But when you got a name like Shelby, well, you kind of get special motors. There was only about 100 of these motors made, and they were called the High Performance 260, and as luck would have it, it produced 260 horsepower at 5,800 RPM. Also in 64, there was another little convertible that had the 260, and that was called the Sunbeam Tiger, which was basically kind of like a 1960s Miata, and the only way to get in it was like putting on a pair of pants. But somehow they squeezed this 260 in the engine bay and made a nice little touring car out of it. But then in April 1963, everybody was wanting more. The horsepower wars were on, and Ford decided to make the 260 even bigger. They enlarged the bore to 4 inches, but kept the same short 2.87-inch stroke, and they developed the high RPM loving Ford 289. The 289 basically came in a lot of different formats because they used it in almost everything. It came as the base engine in everything from Ford Galaxies, Fairlane sedans, and it even came in Falcons, among other cars. The two-barrel version was rated at 195 horsepower at 4,400 RPM. However, when they started to adapt some performance to the 289, it started waking up. With a 4-barrel, it ranged from 200 to 225 horsepower, and then that's where things kind of got a little interesting. A couple of engineers realized that this little motor loved RPM, and that it really woke up with a camshaft. So they came up with the infamous K-code 289, otherwise known as the 289 Hypo. Things were getting kind of serious. Compression was up to 10.5 to 1. They had a dual-point dizzy, screw-in rocker studs, thicker main webs, special connecting rods with bigger bolts, and a solid lifter camshaft and a high nodular crank. The result? 271 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and 312 foot-pounds of torque at 3,400. These Hypo 289s came in Mustangs, and a few even slipped into some Falcons and Fairlanes. Now here's the cool part about the Hypo, and this is just where things get exciting for the 289. You see, at Ford, small block development kind of had a glass ceiling. They felt that if the 289 couldn't get the job done, rather than building bigger small blocks to compete against things like the Chevy 327, that basically they would just go straight from the 289 to the 427, which had a lot of racing development behind it from its NASCAR and Le Mans heritage. So the result was the few people that were working with the 289 had to make it do amazing things because a lot of them didn't want to deal with the weight of the big block. Shelby and his team were just the right people to get this job done. So in 1965, Ford wasn't just involved in drag racing and NASCAR, or their slogan that they were using was total performance. So if there was any racing anywhere, Ford wanted to be involved, whether that was in Europe or here in the United States. And that's where the fun stories about the Ford 289 start to come into play. In the late 1964, Ford wanted to go road racing with the SCCA. However, they didn't really have a sports car. The car that they originally had designed to compete against the Corvette was the Thunderbird. But the problem was the Thunderbird by this time had become a little portly and kind of a luxo barge. So Ford, along with Carroll Shelby, went to the SCCA and lobbied them to allow the new Ford Mustang to compete in the SCCA Production B category. The SCCA wasn't really keen on the idea because they said, hey, sports cars don't have back seats. We don't know how we can justify this. After some negotiating back and forth, Carroll Shelby decided to take the back seats out of the Mustang and got them to admit it into the SCCA Production B category. Now keep in mind, this particular category of the SCCA is not for the faint of heart. This is where the Corvettes were hanging out, along with Jaguar XKEs, among others. There was some stout competition. But the first thing that Shelby had to do was create or build a certain number of production cars in order to qualify for that category. So the street version of this car was called the Shelby GT350. In order to make it a little bit different from the standard Mustang, what Shelby did is when it arrived at his manufacturing facility in California, they changed the 289 and put headers, an aluminum intake, and a bigger 4-barrel carburetor on it. This changed the horsepower from 271 up to 306. However, 306 is not what Shelby raced with. They made a different version of the GT350 called the GT350R, which was the race model. There's a lot of controversy about what the actual horsepower of these 289s were. Some people claim it was as high as 350, which is where they say the name GT350 came from. However, Shelby, in their database, claims it was more in the area of 320 to 330 horsepower. So, how did the 289 do? It kicked some serious bootay. Every single year, 1965, 1966, and 1967, the Shelby GT350 Mustangs won that particular category of the SCCA and took the championship. That's a pretty tall order considering that the Chevrolet Corvettes were running 327s with more horsepower, independent suspension, and fiberglass bodies. So the GT350s weren't the only ones to get the souped-up version of the 289. Shelby was also putting these in his 289 Shelby Cobra Roadsters. Now, as you may recall, Shelby had a bone to pick with some Europeans across the pond. So he made a select few special Cobras known as the FIA Cobra. It had an even stronger version of the 289, and there's some differing opinions on how much horsepower they actually had, but it ranges anywhere from 330 to 350 in a tiny little Cobra. These had wider wheel wells to accommodate bigger tires, air scoops to cool the brakes, and several other features. The FIA Cobras went over to Europe and dominated the Jaguars and even the Ferraris. However, the Cobra had one major drawback, and that was basically that it had the aerodynamics of a barn. So when they started hitting the high speeds of, say, the Le Mans Mulsanne Straight, the Cobra was really pushing a lot of air. Shelby came up with a solution, and after talking to one of his old buddies, they designed a new aerodynamic version of the Cobra known as the Daytona Coupe. The body style was very controversial, however, it made a huge difference. The Daytona Coupes with similar prepared 289s were picking up anywhere from 20 to 30 miles an hour on the long straightaway. But Shelby wasn't going to stop there. He developed another spec of the 289 known as the Le Mans spec. The Le Mans spec had 4 Weber carburetors, worked over cylinder heads, and a huge camshaft. These were producing 385 horsepower from the little 289 and spinning as high as 8,000 RPM. How did they do? Well, they won Le Mans before the GT40 did. So technically, he beat Ferrari and Jaguar and everyone else in its category. There's some interesting stories about the Daytona Coupe and the political back and forth that they had with Ford, but we'll get to that in another story. The Daytona Coupe didn't stop there. They took one out to the Bonneville Salt Flats, where it broke 23 individual land speed records with the Le Mans Spec 289. So on a personal note, we've got a couple of 289s in the shop that are in current projects as we speak. This little guy right here is going in a 1964 Ford Falcon Sprint original 4-speed car, and it's going to be a pretty sweet little gem. It's got a pretty much stock bottom end flat top pistons. These are fully ported GT40 iron heads, custom flat tappet camshaft designed specifically for this motor, and tunnel ram intake. It's a sheet metal deal, which is actually in one of my videos that we did some porting on. We got dual quad 390s with vacuum secondaries, and this one's built for 7,000 plus, but it's also a street car. Now, in the 1960s, of course, one of the most popular areas of racing was drag racing. Most of the big news was circled around big blocks and 4-speeds. 289s with its short stroke was never known as a torque monster. However, Ford did take the 289 drag racing, and it did pretty well. Carroll Shelby took a handful of 289 Roadsters and converted them into drag racing machines. He called them the Dragons. They were a competition spec of the 289 and could be had in 3 different levels. The first level was a single 4-barrel. Stage 2 was a dual quad setup. And the third stage was the Le Mans 4-Weber carburetors, big camshaft engine. They had 445 rear gears and 23 other changes that made these little Cobras hook. So how did they do in drag racing? How does 11.73 in the quarter mile at 119 miles an hour sound? Not too shabby. There was one other version Carroll took on to be a street version of a drag racing 289. Carroll Shelby had an option you could check on the GT350 where you could get a Paxton supercharger installed at his facility and they would deliver it in that form. Motor Trend tested this 1966 GT350 with the Paxton supercharger, and it turned the quarter mile in 14.0 at 104. Now, on the 50 fastest muscle cars list that has circled around the internet, you'll notice that it's right smack almost in the middle. And the next fastest car was the 1970 Hemi Challenger that also turned to 14.0 with a little more mile an hour. The little supercharged 289 was doing pretty good. So sure, 289s were fast, but were they reliable? Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm about to tell you. In 1964, Ford, in one of their advertising campaigns, wanted to show everybody how reliable the 289 was. So they all went to the Daytona Speedway, and they had 4 1964 Mercury Cyclones all equipped with the 289. Most of them say that it was the 289 Hypo. They ran these cars as close to 110 miles an hour consistently as they possibly could, and they ran it, get this, they ran these cars nonstop, just changing out drivers and getting gas and tires for 40 days and 40 nights until they logged 100,000 miles nonstop. Only one of the cars had a mechanical issue, broke a valve spring, but they fixed it, went right back out. Pretty amazing thing that Ford did, and companies just really don't do that anymore with those kind of stunts. But the 289 was awesome. In 1968, Trans Am racing became a thing, and all the factories decided to get involved. The 289 was changed over to the Ford 302 with a longer stroke in order to take advantage of the maximum cubic inch displacement allowed in Trans Am. The 302 was then the mainstay of Ford's small blocks from 1968 all the way into the mid-1990s. So in conclusion, the 289 is an awesome little V8. It wasn't really designed for racing, but when Ford put a lot of money behind it with people like Carroll Shelby, Ken Miles, and many other people in the teams that they decided to go road racing, land speed racing, all those things, it did phenomenal things in the short period of time it was developed. It was also an incredibly durable little engine. However, because the 1960s, the big blocks and the NASCAR and the drag racing, I think this little V8 was probably one of the most overlooked V8s of the 1960s. And if I have to say so myself, I'm not so sure there's another small block out there that has the resume that this one racked up. I'm sure the comments will come flowing in on that one. But anyway, 289s were awesome. Follow us for the 2 289s that we have in the shop right now, and we're excited to get them out on the road here this spring.